On the outside, the house on Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey, looked like a place where nothing bad could ever happen. A sprawling 19-room Victorian mansion, white trim, tall windows, a lawn kept so neatly it seemed trimmed by routine, not effort. It was the kind of home neighbors pointed to when they spoke about stability, about values, about how things should be. Inside that house lived the List family, a family many in the community quietly admired. They went to church every Sunday. They said grace before meals. They believed deeply in discipline, modesty, and obedience. They were, by all outward appearances, the perfect Christian family. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, every person inside that house was already dead. John Emil List was not a man who laughed loudly or spoke loosely. He was reserved, meticulous, serious to the point of discomfort. He served as vice president and comptroller at a bank. He balanced accounts the way he lived his life, carefully, rigidly, without room for error. He believed in rules, he believed in consequences, and above all, he believed in God's judgment. John attended St. John Lutheran Church faithfully. He taught Sunday school. He sang hymns with quiet intensity. He believed the Bible was literal, unquestionable, and absolute. To those who knew him casually, John List was devout. To those who knew him well, he was unyielding. John lived in the house with his wife Helen and their 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. Helen had once been vibrant and social, but by the early 1970s, she was ill. She suffered from advanced syphilis, a diagnosis that John rarely spoke about and seemed to resent as much as fear. Patricia, the eldest daughter, was 16. She enjoyed school, friends, and had begun questioning the rigid lifestyle her father imposed. John Jr., 15, struggled academically. Frederick, 13, was athletic and popular. To outsiders, they looked like a wholesome Christian family. Inside the home, however, tension brewed quietly. John List had lost his job months earlier. No one at church knew. No one in the neighborhood knew. His family didn't even know. Every morning, John put on his suit, picked up his briefcase, and left the house, pretending to go to work. In reality, he spent his days wandering train stations, libraries, and coffee shops. And with every passing day, the pressure inside him grew. John List believed unemployment was a moral failure. He believed financial collapse was spiritual collapse. And most disturbingly, he believed that God demanded order, even if that order came at a terrible cost. John List didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a man chosen to act. That morning, the List children went to school. Helen ate breakfast. Nothing seemed unusual. At some point during the day, John retrieved a 9mm Steyr pistol from his safety deposit box. He returned home, and one by one, he killed every member of his family. Helen was shot first in the back of the head while she drank coffee at the kitchen table. Patricia was shot as she returned from school. John Jr. and Frederick were shot later inside the house. Each killing was methodical, calm, planned. Afterward, John arranged the bodies in the ballroom, placing them side by side, hands folded, faces upward, as if in prayer. He turned on the radio, he wrote letters, and then he did something that would haunt investigators for nearly a decade. He walked away. John List left 5 handwritten letters, one to his pastor, one to his mother, one to his employer, and others explaining his actions. In them, he wrote that he had killed his family to save their souls. He claimed Helen's illness, the children's modern influences, and his financial ruin had endangered their salvation. In his mind, murder was mercy, and escape was simply the next step in God's plan. For nearly a month, the house sat untouched. Lights remained on, mail piled up. The radio continued playing, day and night. Neighbors assumed the family was away. On December 7, 1971, police finally entered the home. What they found inside shocked the nation. This was not a crime of rage. It wasn't fueled by drugs, jealousy, or chaos. It was fueled by belief. Belief twisted so tightly around control and fear that murder felt righteous. And as investigators searched the house, one terrifying truth became clear. John List hadn't just killed his family. He had planned to disappear forever. When police finally discovered the bodies inside the List mansion in December 1971, they expected one thing to follow quickly: an arrest. It never came. Instead, John Emil List had already erased himself. John List didn't flee in panic. He didn't leave blood trails, frantic notes, or half-baked lies. He left cleanly. He closed bank accounts. He canceled insurance policies. He mailed letters explaining his actions. He boarded a train and disappeared into the vast anonymity of America. To investigators, this was deeply unsettling, because criminals who act in desperation usually make mistakes. John List did not. He vanished like a man who had rehearsed this moment for years. The discovery of the List family murders made national headlines. A respected church-going father, 5 family members dead, bodies arranged as if for burial, a suspect gone without a trace. For weeks, newspapers carried his photo. Police believed he couldn't last long. Someone would recognize him. Someone would turn him in. But weeks became months. Months became years, and John List was never seen. Somewhere along the way, John List became Robert Peter Clark. He obtained identification. He found work. He blended in, and he did it with the same discipline and structure that had defined his old life. There was no wild escape story, no criminal underworld, no hiding in darkness. John List did something far more disturbing. He joined a church. Under his new identity, List moved to Denver, Colorado, and later Richmond, Virginia. He worked as an accountant. He attended Lutheran churches. He volunteered. He sang hymns. He prayed. To those around him, Robert Clark was quiet, devout, dependable. He was the kind of man churches trusted with finances, the kind of man neighbors described as deeply religious, the kind of man no one questioned. In 1985, John List remarried. His new wife, Alma, believed she had married a widower, a shy man who had suffered loss, a man whose reserve seemed like grief. She had no idea she was sleeping beside a man who had murdered his entire family. And this is where the horror deepens, because John List didn't stop being religious after the murders. He became more involved. List didn't drink heavily. He didn't abuse Alma. He didn't display violent tendencies. He followed rules. He lived modestly. He believed in order. And that made him invisible, because society often looks for monsters in chaos. John List represented structure. By the late 1970s, the case had gone cold. The FBI chased sightings across the country. None panned out. There were theories. He had fled the country. He had changed his appearance. He had died. But no proof ever surfaced. The List house was eventually sold. Time moved forward. The world changed. John List aged quietly. Criminal profilers later described List as one of the chilling family annihilators in U.S. history, not because of brutality, but because of justification. He believed God required his actions. His family's deaths were merciful. His escape was permitted. This was not madness, it was ideology. And ideology doesn't erode with time, it strengthens. John List altered his name, his location, his routines, but he couldn't change his face, and decades later, that would be his undoing. In 1989, the case took a dramatic turn. A television show dedicated to capturing fugitives decided to revisit the List murders. They commissioned a forensic sculptor to create an age-progressed bust of John List. What they produced shocked even seasoned investigators, because the sculpture didn't look like a criminal. It looked like the man sitting next to you in church. When the episode aired, millions watched, including someone who knew Robert Clark, and suddenly a quiet, devout man in Virginia didn't look so harmless anymore. For nearly 18 years, John List had lived under a simple assumption: time forgives what memory forgets. He had changed his name, he had changed his address, he had changed his life, but he had not changed his face. And in 1989, that face was about to appear on television. By the late 1980s, America's Most Wanted had become something few criminals fully understood: a national dragnet powered by ordinary people. The show didn't rely on wiretaps or undercover stings. It relied on recognition: a scar, a voice, a posture, a face that felt familiar. When producers chose to feature the List family murders, they knew the case had everything: a shocking crime, a vanished suspect, and a mystery old enough to feel unsolvable. But they also knew something else: List had lived long enough to age. So they did something unprecedented. A forensic artist was commissioned to create an age-progressed bust of John List. Not a sketch, not a drawing, a three-dimensional face. Wrinkles, sagging skin, a receding hairline, the subtle heaviness of a man approaching 70. When the bust was revealed, investigators felt something close to dread, because the face staring back at them didn't look evil, it looked ordinary. When the episode aired, millions of Americans watched, including people who didn't realize they were watching a murderer's reflection. In Richmond, Virginia, a woman named Frank Bender, the very sculptor who created the bust, would later say the likeness felt disturbingly real. But it wasn't the artist who made the call. It was someone closer, someone who knew the man behind the mask. In a quiet Virginia neighborhood, a woman sat watching the program and felt her stomach tighten. The bust on the screen looked like Robert Clark, the man who lived nearby, the man who went to church, the man everyone trusted. At first, she dismissed the thought. It was impossible. Then she looked again. The posture, the eyes, the quiet seriousness. She picked up the phone. And with that call, 18 years of freedom began to collapse. The tip led agents to a modest home in Richmond. They didn't storm it, they knocked. The man who answered the door was polite, calm, confused. His name, he said, was Robert Clark. But when agents asked for fingerprints, the truth surfaced immediately. Robert Clark was John Emil List. When confronted, List did not resist. He did not run. He did not deny who he was. Instead, he did something far more chilling. He sighed, as if the weight he had carried for nearly 2 decades had finally been acknowledged. News spread quickly. The man who had murdered his entire family and vanished had been living openly among churchgoers. He had remarried. He had paid taxes. He had prayed beside strangers every Sunday, and no one had known. The public reaction was visceral, because if John List could disappear so completely, who else had? Alma List, his second wife, was devastated. She had believed his story of being a widower. She had trusted his quiet nature. She had shared a bed with a man who once lined up his family's bodies and folded their hands. Her shock became a national symbol of betrayal, not just of marriage, but of trust itself. When John List was taken into custody, one question followed him everywhere. Did he regret it? Those who interviewed him later would say this: He regretted being caught. He did not regret what he believed was God's will. Most criminals hide in shadows. John List hid in virtue, in church pews, in hymnals, in polite smiles and folded hands. And that made him invisible. When John Emil List finally stood inside a New Jersey courtroom in 1990, the distance between the crime and the moment of judgment felt almost unreal. 19 years had passed since the night he murdered his entire family. 19 years since the house on Hillside Avenue fell silent. 19 years during which he prayed, remarried, worked, and blended seamlessly into church communities that never suspected the truth. Now, at last, he was no longer Robert Clark. He was John List again, and the world wanted answers. The courtroom was packed, not only with reporters and law enforcement, but with a palpable sense of absence. 5 empty seats existed in that room, whether anyone said it aloud or not. Helen List, his wife, Patricia, his daughter, John Jr., his son, Frederick, his youngest child, Alma, the wife who never got to speak as a victim, but whose life had also been destroyed. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. The facts were devastating enough. John List had admitted to the killings. He had left letters explaining his motives. He had fled and lived under an assumed identity for nearly 2 decades. The defense had no reasonable path to innocence. Their only strategy was explanation. List's attorneys did not deny the murders. Instead, they tried to contextualize them. They spoke about financial collapse, mental strain, religious obsession, a man under unbearable pressure. But something was missing from their argument: remorse. At no point did John List express sorrow for taking 5 lives. When he spoke calmly, carefully, as if he were still explaining an accounting error. When given the opportunity to address the court, John List did not apologize. He did not beg forgiveness. He spoke instead about salvation. He said he believed his family was now safe in heaven, that their deaths had spared them from moral decay, that God would understand. For many in the courtroom, this was the most chilling moment of all. Not the murders, not the escape, but the realization that John List had never changed his belief. The jury deliberated briefly. The outcome was inevitable. Guilty on all counts. 5 murders. 1 annihilated family. No ambiguity. List was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would never again walk freely among unsuspecting communities. The judge's words were firm but restrained. Justice finally had arrived, but it came too late to save anyone. Alma List, his second wife, divorced him immediately. She later said she had never suspected the truth. She had trusted him because he seemed moral, religious, safe. Her pain represented something the court could never fully address: the collateral damage of deception. John List hadn't only murdered his family, he weaponized trust. Many crimes are driven by rage, jealousy, or impulse. This one was driven by ideology. John List believed authority justified violence, faith excused murder, control equaled righteousness, and, perhaps most unsettling, he lived proof that evil doesn't always look chaotic. Sometimes it looks disciplined, organized, respectable. John List died in prison in 2008 at the age of 82. There was no deathbed confession, no apology, no final reckoning, just silence. The state closed the file, but the questions never fully went away. Was John List insane, or was he terrifyingly rational within a belief system that allowed no flexibility? Psychologists still debate it, because if the answer is insanity, the crime is easier to contain. But if the answer is belief, then the crime becomes harder to dismiss. The List family murders force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Faith can be weaponized. Appearances can be lies. Order can mask obsession. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it kneels beside you in church. Can extreme belief ever excuse extreme violence? Would John List have been caught without America's Most Wanted? Is justice meaningful when it arrives decades late? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story disturbed you, challenged you, or made you think differently about trust and belief, like the video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes, turn on notifications so you never miss the next investigation. These stories matter because remembering them helps prevent them.